All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Nuran Al-Hamdan. I am a graduate research fellow with the Program for Palestine and Palestinian Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to MEI and Foundation for Middle East Peace for co-sponsoring this event. With that, another welcome to our webinar, Palestinian Refugees Beyond the Trump Era. Following decades of failed policy towards Palestinian refugee and in light of the Trump presidency, the defunding of UNRWA, and other acts of hostility towards the Palestinians, we're asking the question, what hope exists for promoting greater rights and access to services for displaced Palestinians? Joining us to discuss these issues and shed light on other topics, we have Matthias Schmal. He is the Director of Field Operations in Gaza, Dalia Al-Masri, a Palestinian-Canadian journalist and human rights advocate, and Raed Jarrar, who I was initially going to just introduce as a political advocate, but it's his third day on the job as Advocacy Director of Dawn. So with that, we're going to get into the discussion. I do want to encourage everybody to submit their questions using the Q&A feature. It should be right at the bottom of your screen. Of Zoom. If you're calling in or if you're watching live on YouTube, you can email your question to events@mei.edu and we can take your question from there. So I want to start with you, Matthias. You're joining us live from Gaza. I think it's very important and timely to ask you, what is the current status of Palestinian refugees in Gaza, given not only the blockade, the current economic situation, but the global pandemic that we're all experiencing?
Thank you, and good afternoon, good evening, my time from Gaza City. A real pleasure and privilege to join you on this important webinar and for this discussion. And so on your question, what's the current situation? The latest trends in terms of the COVID pandemic are really extremely worrying. We've had over the last few weeks a steep rise in daily infections, between 700 and 800 daily. We now have 122 people dead. I realize that some of these data may not sound very dramatic from a US perspective, but what one has to keep in mind here in Gaza is, first of all, the prison-like conditions. It's cut off from the world, so it's like a cruise ship. And we know what's happened on cruise ships where there's been an outbreak. And part of the impact of the blockade is that the health sector is collapsing. It hasn't collapsed totally yet, but what my World Health Organization colleagues and Ministry of Health officials are saying is that if we cannot turn this around together, meaning trends towards increasing infection rates, we are 2 weeks away from hospitals reaching maximum capacity. So if this trend doesn't stop, in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, hospitals will have to turn people away. Now, the critical issue then will be how many are sick, how many need urgent treatment, and people will die on the streets or at home if we don't get this stopped. Now, an hour ago, I understand the Ministry of Health here announced further strict measures, so they're closing all schools and universities. They are keeping businesses open. Now, part of the challenge, maybe as a last point, is that of the 2 million people living in Gaza, and 1.4 million of those are Palestine refugees, for which we have a responsibility as UNRWA. It's estimated that half the population here depends on daily paid work. Starting out as taxi drivers, selling cigarettes on the street. And obviously the worry is if you lock the place down, you have 500,000 people without income. So it's as in other parts of the world, but it's particularly grave here, this constant battle between public health considerations and economic considerations. And this is all happening in the 14th year of blockade with Gaza and its population on its knees.
Thank you for that sobering update, Matthias. I think you do touch on this a bit in talking about the role of UNRWA in serving 1.4 million Palestinian refugees. That's a huge number. So I'm actually going to divert the next question to Dalia. because it relates. Dalia, you've written and described the Trump deal of the century as a plan to politically rob Palestinians. We know that part of the Trump strategy has been defunding UNRWA, which of course adds to the stress that folks like Matthias and other public servants are doing in the service of Palestinian refugees. Can you speak to how American foreign policy during Trump and prior to it has impacted Palestinian refugees? And if there's an opportunity for the issue of Palestinian refugees, whether a political issue or a humanitarian issue, can be included in a Biden foreign policy as well? And I know you're calling us from Canada, so if you have any Canadian insight to add as well from the Canada context.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. So to kind of just dive right into Nuran's question, essentially over the past 4 years, we saw foreign policy reach new heights in the United States between Trump and between Prime Minister Netanyahu. So essentially foreign policy shifted to an all new level of right-wing supremacism. And so Palestinian refugees under the Trump administration were essentially disregarded. And a lot of the Trump policies relating to Palestine were at the expense of Palestinians themselves in order to benefit Israel, in order to continue the United States predecessors' pro-Israel policies that all but rejected the Palestinian refugee right of return. So essentially under Trump, all of these factors just heightened. And I kind of see that skepticism from previous administrations, from Obama, from George W. Bush, from Bill Clinton. They have all set the foundation for pro-Israel policies that completely reject Palestinian right of return. And so under Trump, Palestinians lost a lot of time and they lost a lot of defense. So they had no mechanisms in order to counterattack all of these policies put in place to further oppress them. Palestinians under occupation had no support from global actors because Trump continued to dish out different policies. And I looked to the deal of the century in 2020 in January, essentially disregarded refugees in that plan, also co-written by Jared Kushner. And Jared Kushner himself is also, basically all of them, Trump and the Klan, are all against the Palestinian right of return. So under this Trump admin, Palestinians had no concessions. Palestinians had no time to fight back. And by doing so, Israel had this very incredibly increasing opportunity to continue doing what it was doing, building more settlements in the West Bank, continuing with annexation. A lot of people think that annexation stopped, which was set in July, but it actually continued. Israel continues to build settlements right now. And so when I look to a future Biden administration come January, I think of Biden's previous political engagements, because we all know that Joe Biden was vice president with the Obama administration for 8 years in the White House, and we didn't see any concessions for Palestinians themselves. We also know that Obama is anti-Palestinian right of return. Biden himself has remained a bit quiet on this subject right now. So what I see right now for Palestinians themselves is a chance for the Democratic Party itself to lean towards a social justice-centric polity. So I look to the members of Congress, which we all know, such as Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Cori Bush, Ilhan Omar. These Democratic members have the chance to really push forward for more rights for Palestinians, and not just beyond actually aid, beyond UNRWA aid, because I think that many times the US leverages this aid in order to box Palestinians in one scenario, and in order to push that rhetoric that Palestinians must be civilized in order to receive aid. And this is always conditioned and it's always politicized. So I see that there is an opportunity with the Biden administration, although I'm not disillusioned, because I'm aware that whether it's a Republican in that White House or a Democrat in the White House, there's always going to be that pro-Israel lobby stance. And with a Biden administration, it's going to return to a more normalized liberal peace process stance. And this means that there's a lot more work to be done. And this work can be done through organizing, through grassroots, through campaigning, And a lot of this work is done through regular folk and also through journalists, academics, lawyers, human rights workers who challenge the status quo and challenge this rhetoric of pro-Israel lobbying. And especially with policies themselves, policies have a huge chance to change, and the Democratic Party itself has this opportunity.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, you went ahead and touched on my next question. I did want to say that your point about aid being used as leverage, I really find that to be a potent point, and I think we need to be wary of attempts to reinstate aid to UNRWA, even though that should definitely be happening, but it definitely can't be the end all be all, because for a lot of folks that is just a chance to pacify this discussion about Palestinian refugees in the greater context of the peace process and the occupation. So thank you for our segue, Dalia. This is Raed. You are a political advocate in the US, Raed, and you've worked on a lot of these issues, and I'm sure pertaining to Palestinian refugees as well. How do you think Palestinian refugees can be incorporated into the US policy radar? Often policy discussions are focused on very specific things like settlements, the occupation, the blockade in Gaza, even annexation more recently. But how can that discussion be expanded to include what a lot of people would say is a key issue that is at the heart of Palestinian grievances?
You are right. The issue is a key issue. If we look at the discussions pertaining to Palestine internationally or in the Middle East, the issue of Palestine refugees is a key issue. And it's a key issue because half of the Palestinian people live outside of historic Palestine. Half. So out of the estimated 13 million Palestinians around the world, 6.5 million live outside of historic Palestine, and 6.5 million live in Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and inside 1948, Palestinian citizens of Israel. It's a huge issue. It's a huge issue also because it has a lot of foundations in international law, whether it is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the Geneva Conventions. There are very strong foundations to demand the return of Palestinian refugees who lost their homes in 48 and 67. More importantly, the United Nations passed two monumental resolutions pertaining to Palestinian refugees. One is the United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. And the other one is the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3236. These are all extremely strong international body binding language and frameworks pertaining to the right of return of Palestinian refugees to their homes. Now, unfortunately, here in DC, this issue is completely ignored. Not because policymakers and the U.S. government does not know about it. It is ignored because there is a deliberate policy to delete this issue from the agenda, to remove the issue from the agenda. And I think even speaking about funding UNRWA, which is an amazing organization doing amazing work for Palestine refugees around the region, including Gaza, the political attacks targeting UNRWA are not only targeting UNRWA to defund it and defund the humanitarian assistance that it does, but it's also targeting UNRWA because UNRWA continues to be one of few international institutions dedicated to supporting Palestine refugees. And the Israeli government's policies under Netanyahu and the US government's policies under Trump are to disregard all international law references and frameworks, including frameworks about annexation or occupation or refugees. And that's why the issue is missing. And I think, like, to answer your question, how can we bring it back to the table? this very conversation that we're having now is an extremely important step to bringing this issue back to the table in Washington, D.C. It's very rarely discussed in D.C. I know that many of our audiences today happen to live and work in D.C., in New York, and with think tanks. So just putting this issue on the radar to understand the importance of it, that there are millions of Palestinians around the world who view themselves as Palestinian. Many of them, like myself, have a card from UNRWA that says you are a refugee. Actually, my family has two cards from UNRWA, one from 1948 and one from 1967. We are both IDPs and refugees. Millions of Palestinians are like that. Millions others don't have, they're not an UNRWA carrying card, but they come from Palestinian heritage. And without taking this into consideration, there will not be a just resolution to the situation in Israel-Palestine, without thinking about the implications of what is going to happen to Palestinian refugees and what's going to happen to them legally or politically or economically, without incorporating that into our vision for a just resolution, there will not be a just resolution. We're literally speaking about half of the Palestinian people. How can we come up with a just resolution to a case with excluding half of its people? It's impossible. And if there is an account out there trying to resolve the situation in Israel-Palestine without taking the refugee question into account, it will definitely fail.
Thank you so much for that, Ra'ed. I definitely related to some of what you were saying. My family also still has their UNRWA cards. My grandparents, keep them in a box in Jordan. They were IDPs before, 1967. So it's very relatable. And I think you get at the heart of the issue, which is that every Palestinian, this refugee experience is integral to their identity. So how can you solve the conflict or even, begin to have a peace process that doesn't include such a huge segment of the population at the table? It seems very counterintuitive. You did touch on some points regarding the defunding of UNRWA that I think Matthias will be perfect to answer for us. Matthias, to preface this question, I came across a tweet written by the former US ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley. And in the tweet, she was promoting an article that was titled something, I don't want to share the exact title, no one give this article clicks, but it was something along the lines of how, Trump can expose like this huge lie, and that lie is the Palestinian refugee myth. And in the article, there are a ton of claims about how, the numbers are inflated and that Palestinians are not really refugees and they chose to leave of their own accord, which is something that historians could easily refute, but something that's always part and parcel of this denial of the Palestinian refugee narrative is actually a very technical argument in which these folks will argue that UNRWA is feeding into Palestinian exceptionalism and that Palestinians shouldn't be treated from other refugees who fall under the UNHCR umbrella. And there's always also claims that no other people in the world pass on their refugee status the way Palestinian refugees do to their, children. So we'd love to hear from you, kind of how do attempts to disenfranchise the Palestinian refugee narrative, how do those impact policy? How can they be countered? And if you could speak directly to this issue of what the difference is between how UNRWA and how UNHCR deal with refugees.
Thank you. And I've seen the article you referred to, and I think it's that you don't mention where to find it because it's not very helpful and it's full of lies. So a couple of things to say. First of all, there are striking similarities between how UNRWA approaches the Palestine refugees and how UNHCR approaches all other refugees. And one of those is that it's simply not true, no matter how many times Trump representatives say this, that UNRWA is the only organization that has refugee status across generations. It's just simply false. If you go to the issue of Ethiopian or Eritrean refugees, Afghan refugees, there are enough refugee populations where the refugee status is carried forward through the generations until the issue is resolved. One interesting fact that not many people know, and I know that at one point our Secretary General actually challenged the Trump administration around this, is that the UNHCR has a three-tier approach to solving refugee crisis. The first one is to return them home. So, you know, in those terms, be my guest and hand over the issue to UNHCR, because they will, as a first measure, look at right of return. Okay, that's very clear in their mandate. The second issue, if return doesn't work, it's integration where they are. Again, I invite people to be our guest and discuss with and negotiate with the Jordanian king or the Lebanese government to integrate Palestine refugees into their respective countries. And the third approach of UNHCR is repatriation to a third country. Now, again, let's find the countries that are willing to take an additional 5.5 million refugees and integrate them into their respective countries. So it's simply nonsensical when people argue, let's get rid of UNRWA and turn the refugees over to UNHCR. I think a further important consideration is that, you know, for me, the one key difference between Palestine refugees and all other refugee communities is that Palestine refugees do not have a country they can call their own and can return to. That's the issue here. And that's why UNRWA was created before UNHCR. You know, UNRWA, as one Secretary General, not Ban Ki-moon, I think it was, once said, is the result of political failure of the international community to establish the state of Palestine. So the discussion should not be about what UNRWA does or doesn't do. It should be around the way to end UNRWA is not to defund it, but to create a political solution, as was promised more than 70 years ago. And let me maybe say one more thing on this. One of you said correctly that the defunding of the Trump administration of UNRWA was in fact a political act. You know, it was politicizing humanitarian aid. This was never about the education work we do, the 287,000 children that are in our schools in Gaza. It was, I think, about registration. The issue is, as long as we continue registering the descendants of the original generation that was kicked off their land, the issue will not go away. You know, and I would even go further and say, even if they ever managed to destroy UNRWA, you are all proof of this who've said you have a registration card. You know, the very point of that is that if there ever is a just solution, that will entitle those people with the card to participate in that just solution. And that is why I think the issue was always really about that, not about our services, not about our budget. It was to try and get the registration off the table, because the hope is that eventually then the refugee question will be off the table and the Palestinian issue will be much more easy to solve. And that's an illusion. Some of you have already referred to that.
Thank you so much for that, Matthias. We're all doing a great job, by the way, at predicting my next questions, which just shows the level of expertise that you all have. My next question is to Dalia, and Matthias did touch on some of these points. But in your opinion, Dalia, what is the international community's responsibility to Palestinian refugees? The international community has clearly failed in the past, in the present. What should it be doing that it's currently not to prevent more failure in the future?
Yeah, so essentially, we saw that under the Trump administration, the international community essentially lost any support that they gave to Palestinians, and they all essentially rendered themselves useless because, you know, Trump kept putting out these policies, these legislations, cutting UNRWA aid, he kept kind of dishing out these policies in which the international community just proved to be fruitless for. And the response was actually staggering, because we kept having people say, you know, UNRWA needs its aid, refugees need education, they need homes. Palestinians themselves deserve human rights. This is like at the core of the basic fundamental social justice issue. And so, you know, we kept having people speak out, but essentially there was nothing tangible for this. And the international community itself lost its way because of Trump. And essentially, as we kind of return to this normalized administration with the future Biden administration, I personally believe that it just leaves Palestinian refugees as a political scapegoat, especially in the under international law. There just remains a lot of cracks in the community and what it's doing. So different state actors, I look to Canada specifically, has continuously enabled the United States to get away with what it's doing. Canada itself has supported Israel's policies. Canada supports US policies. Even if they don't outright support them, they silently support them. So their silence is an answer on its own. We also see this with the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. He has enabled Trump to continue acting the way he did. He is going to continue supporting Joe Biden. And we also see this with his VP, Kamala Harris. She's also been notoriously pro-Israel. So all of these factors kind of go hand in hand in seeing what the international community will do and seeing its response as we go into the future, because American foreign policy is not going to change as much. And the Biden administration itself safeguards US interests in the Middle East. And they build on that Orientalist and racist notion of having an ally propel and propagate their political interest. So the international community itself remains on the backbone of the US. And that's why I think right now the change needs to go beyond just looking at the US as a superpower, beyond looking at the US as the safe haven, as a savior for all of us, essentially, because whatever the US does impacts everyone else, and not just people in the US. As we've seen, it impacts people in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in Latin America. So right now, the international community itself has kind of lost its way. And as it kind of rebuilds its movement and rebuilds that movement we have right now with the future Biden administration, there is a chance to essentially change the way aid is leveraged as a political mean for US to control Palestinians. And by doing so, the international community also has that prospect. It has that prospect to look to social justice and incorporate that in their policies. So essentially, regardless of who's in the White House, right now, as we get rid of Trump, we kind of see that, that chance to propel Palestinian interests at the forefront.
Thank you so much for that, Dadia. Raed, I have a somewhat similar question, but I'm actually going to bring this one closer to home. So we've discussed what the international community can do to change, what US foreign policy can do to change. But in your opinion, what do you think Palestinian leadership should be doing to change in terms of diplomacy, outreach, representation, to recenter the issue of Palestinian refugees? In the past, when there was a more representative PLO at the helm, that's what was happening. That's clearly not the case anymore. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, before I comment on that, actually, I do want to say that I am a little bit more optimistic than Dalia when it comes to where the international community stands. I actually feel like the Trump administration and the Netanyahu administration, they really don't have a legal framework to justify what they're doing. There is no debate outside in the international community on whether or not Palestine refugees should go back home. There is no debate. It's like similar to the scientific opinion on global warming. There is no debate. There is an induced debate on the issue that is funded by special interests, and there is a fake debate on what's going on with Palestine refugees or annexation or other issues. But when it comes to the reality, the international community has been very solid in saying that there is only one view when it comes to the war crime of annexing new land. There is no one saying that you can annex Palestinian land and it's fine, or a new interpretation of the Geneva Conventions, or a new interpretation of state responsibility under international law. There is no foundation to that. But I would say at the same time, the US government, as Dalia mentioned, continues to be a part of the problem. It is one of the largest parts of the problem. We talked about how the US government abuses humanitarian aid as leverage to play political games with the lives of Palestinians. At the same time, our own government refuses to use $3.8 billion of military aid to Israel that are being used daily to commit human rights violations, to abuse Palestinian rights in historic Palestine, to commit war crimes such as annexing occupied land with our tax dollars. And we have seen an extremely strong movement inside the United States most recently, even in Congress. There is a strong movement in Congress to say we can't continue to fund Israel's violations with our tax dollars. And this message is literally earth-shattering, because this short message, we can't continue to fund Israel's violations with our tax dollars, is a message that was not heard in DC before. Now it is becoming a prevailing message. We heard unprecedented numbers of members of Congress sending letters asking to have some sort of accountability when it comes to that. So I think my answer to you is that I feel that as someone who lives in DC, that regardless of the lack of leadership and the fragmentation of leadership of Palestinians in historic Palestine, what we can do in the United States is do no more harm, trying to stop our own government from contributing to the violations, from adding fuel to the fire that's happening there. And that would allow for better circumstances for Palestinians inside historic Palestine to choose their leadership in a more democratic, a more transparent way. Honestly, I don't feel like I or other people in DC, whether we were Palestinian or not Palestinian, I don't feel like we have leverage to tell Palestinians in Gaza or in the West Bank or inside 48 how to choose their leadership. I have a lot of criticism to the political leadership in Palestine, but I don't think that is my added value as me, who is someone living in Washington, D.C. I feel like my added value is to activate the mechanisms that we have here in the United States to stop our own government from funding. So let's give you an example before I stop answering Nuran. The US has existing law that would prohibit the United States from funding any foreign units engaged in gross violations of human rights. And although Israel receives more than 50% of the entirety of foreign military financing, the entirety of military aid going through the State Department goes to Israel. Although that is the case, and although we have hundreds of documented cases of gross violations of human rights, there has not been a single one case where the United States applied its own law and suspended our aid from violating units. It's a scandal. We have no tracking mechanism. We have no absolute no compliance with US law when it comes to Israel. The other example is annexation. Annexation is a war crime that we should not be funding with our tax dollars. Congresswoman Betty McCollum introduced a bill a couple months ago, HR 8050, that would prohibit the United States from recognizing or funding, directly or indirectly, any acts of annexation by Israel. And her argument is, we have to do that. That is actually in the US law, that is in international law. We're not being extra do-gooders by doing this. This is the minimum requirements that we have to do. So I feel like we have a lot of work from the US side to make sure that Israeli abuses do not go with no accountability, but also that we don't fund them and help them with these violations.
Thank you for that, Raed. So we're going to actually start taking some questions from the audience who are also on the same page as us because they are very relevant and timely. I'm going to direct this first one to you, Matthias. I guess it's a somewhat critical question, so I think we'll all be very interested in hearing your response. But the questioner is asking that Palestinians in Palestine and abroad have gained an increasing distrust of international law and the power of the United Nations and in its branches and organizations to solve our social, political, and economic problems. How can we strengthen our trust again in international law and in the international community and its subsequent organizations to turn blank statements into legitimate policy changes and actions?
That's a complicated one. Because of course I work for the UN, so I should be in some ways defending it. I'm, having said that, well aware there is a crisis of confidence in trust, I think, around the globe in established institutions, including the UN, and our Secretary General has said as much. Guterres, that under his tenure, he hopes that we as UN will regain some trust in that respect. How will we do that? Well, I think it's picking up on some of the things that Raed said in terms of accountability. I think, you know, part of the role of the international community is to hold people who do things wrongly and who tread on human rights to account. Let me make that very specific. And there, maybe I'm more on Dalia's side in terms of pessimism on the international community. I've been here 3 years now in Gaza, a bit more. 2 years of those were characterized by the so-called Great Marches of Return, where a staggering 35,000 people were injured over two years. Some of them left with lifelong disabilities, 120 or so still waiting for rehabilitative surgery. Over 200 people killed, including 13 children who went to UNRWA schools. Where was the outcry of the international community? You know, I sometimes asked in media work, if this had happened at the Mexican border, would the Mexican-US border, that is, would the international community have been as quiet? You know, so we talk often about annexation and the West Bank, but you know, for me, it is a scandal that 2 years could pass by without proper accountability for injuring, for disproportionate policing and responses to, essentially, by intent at least, peaceful demonstrations. So one issue is, I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but you know, as international community and facilitated by the UN, there must be greater accountability for violations of human rights. The other thing I believe that we can do as UN to regain trust is to perhaps question a bit whether the formulas and solutions we've promoted for 3-4 decades are still relevant. So what I'm speaking of course, is more concretely the two-state solution. You know, it is hard to imagine for any Palestinian I speak to in Gaza how you can really build one state out of Gaza and the West Bank, being apart geographically, you know, and the absurd ideas contained in the Trump plan of building an overland rail line or a tunnel to connect the two. You know, it's just bizarre to think how you can create one state out of this. And if you look at the West Bank itself, it's like a Swiss cheese. If you look at the settlements, you know, it's no longer a coherent piece of land that even the West Bank itself cannot, you all know this, be turned into a viable economy and political entity. So where I'm going with this is, I think the international community could regain trust if it's willing to question itself and what it's done through the Oslo process 30 years later, and whether it is time to open a new page. And for me, the new page is, and there I'm with Raed, you know, it's not for me as an outsider, I'm in Gaza, but as an outsider, to tell Palestinians what their solutions should be. I think what the UN and the international community needs to facilitate is space for genuine dialogue, where especially the voices of young people on both sides, but of course, especially Palestinian voices, are given a chance to express themselves on what kind of leadership they want and what for them is a solution that would meet their aspirations for dignity and justice.
Thank you for that, Matthias. The next question, I'd actually, like to divide between both Raed and Dalia. So both of you feel free to answer this one. This is, I would assume, a question that's playing almost like the devil's advocate for the other side, but I actually think I'm actually happy to see it here, and I think it's important to address. So the question is, there continues to be discussion of a just resolution. What does that mean? Palestinians want concessions, but what is actually being talked about? The truth is that there will be no return, as there is no return of 800,000 Jews who were kicked out of Arab lands. A return means the end of the only Jewish state while there are a couple of dozen of Arab states. The problem is to take care of these people. I'm assuming they mean refugees, and that is a different question. I'm going to tie in another question that's much shorter and simple, but I think it's also relevant. And the question is basically saying that some people posit that the issue of refugees and their return is what has prevented a peace process. So can you also respond to that premise? And I leave it to you to answer that.
I mean, I can start with a few thoughts, and maybe Dalia can dig deeper into the issue. I trust her judgment in being more in depth than I will be. My thought is that this language reminds me of the demographic threat language, which is extremely problematic. I think if in the United States we used any of the mainstream language about the demographic threat of a minority, it will be labeled as racist and unacceptable. Like, imagine if we had a narrative in the US that says, we can't allow African Americans or Latinos, Latinx communities to, like, for example, we can't allow Latinx communities to be citizens. We can't allow them a path to citizenship because that is a demographic threat that will make the United States not white. Like, imagine how would we receive this kind of rhetoric here in the US? Unfortunately, this rhetoric in Israel is very mainstream. In Israel, Palestinians are referred to as demographic threat. The fact that Palestinians are growing in numbers is a demographic threat. The fact that Palestinian refugees have the right to come back, it is a threat to what many Israelis, what the Israeli government views as the identity of the state. And it's very, very problematic to hear this. It's very problematic, and it resonates with many activists who worked against the apartheid in South Africa. Many of the activists who are working against apartheid in other parts of the world, whether it is in Myanmar or other places, that this notion of viewing an entire people's existence as a threat and having coding racism into law is really terrifying. And I've heard many people in the US, even allies who are like liberal, who are more in tune with civil rights issues in the US, who would also reiterate these kind of extremely problematic narratives about Israel-Palestine without thinking about it in a US context or a European context or a Canadian context. So that's my 2 cents that I wanted to say before I hear from Dalia what she thinks about the rest of the question.
So just continuing from Raed, I think I'm going to go a different route. So I want to touch on the fact that the history of the Jewish populations in the Middle East actually runs for decades, if not. And so their presence has existed, and this is a fact. And so this question itself, when I think about it, it peddles the rhetoric that Palestinian expulsion, that Palestinian genocide in 1948 is acceptable because the Jews were persecuted in the Holocaust, right? So this is essentially what the question means. It means that at the expense of Palestinians during the Nakba, in the catastrophe, that their expulsion is justifiable. And so to turn a different route, I would say that Palestinians look to a more just process in which refugees can return because the refugees were kicked out as the creation of the state of Israel was created. So in my opinion, I don't think that this question itself is pushes a narrative of dialogue, because it kind of has a racist rhetoric to it. Because while we identify that the population of the Jewish people has been in the Middle East for decades and their contributions has been lengthy, we also can't put that at the expense of Palestinians and the right of return and ending the occupation, right? Just because Palestinians, were kicked out of their lands, it doesn't mean it's justifiable for refugees not to have the right of return. It doesn't mean that just because there are Arab states neighboring them, it doesn't mean that Palestinians can actually settle there. Palestinians already face discrimination in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan. Palestinians in Lebanon can't even get citizenship. They are not afforded the similar rights of Lebanese citizens in Syria as well. So peddling this rhetoric is very problematic, continuing with what Raed said. And so essentially that is my answer to that, because I get this question so many times and it's the same outcome essentially. People try to discredit the fact of what happened in 1948. So that's where I tie in the answer to this question. It's a good question, but also we have to kind of break it down and understand what's behind it and why people ask this question, because it is justifying Palestinian oppression.
I can add one more thing, Noran, unless you want to move on to the next question. So the thing I wanted to say is that I've also heard this whataboutism when it comes to Palestinian rights, and it usually comes from a bad place. It comes from voices that try to either minimize or disregard Palestinian struggles by saying, what about Syria? Look what Assad is doing to his people. What about Sisi? What about Iraq? What about Afghanistan? I never understand that logic, because I think many of us work on all of these issues. We condemn violence and racism and apartheid and all of these acts, whether they come from the Israeli government or Sisi or Assad or other US allies in the region. But I don't understand what is the value of pointing out to other violations. So the question also includes this similar violations that happened to Jewish Arabs from Iraq, Morocco. I don't think many of your audience know this fun fact that in the population of Israel, 20% of the population, 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinian citizens of Israel. So these are Muslim and Christian citizens who are Palestinian. But on top of that, there is a 30% on top of the 20% who are Arab Jews, either from Iraq or Morocco or Tunisia or other places. And they were expelled after racist attacks that targeted them in the 1940s and 1950s. I think if the premise of the question that to disregard Palestinian rights because there are other similar crises that happened around the same time and catastrophes that happened at the same time, my answer would be no, let's fix both. I think Palestinian refugees have to go back home in accordance to international law and international framework, and Iraqi Jews have to also be compensated, and Yemeni Jews and Moroccan Jews have to be compensated and have to have the right to go back home. to Iraq or to Yemen. Actually, I know that the Israeli government advocates for compensation from these Arab countries to pay for Jewish citizens of those countries who ended up being expelled after the racist attacks. So I'm just saying, like, this like whataboutism logic does not work. We're in 2020. I think most of us who work in this field will not say only advocate for Palestinian rights and disregard, Jewish rights or minority Jews of color in Israel who are treated as second-class humans, or disregard, the crimes committed against Arabs in a neighboring country. We never say these things. It is a time of intersectionality. It is the time that African Americans and Latinx communities and Arab communities and Muslim communities are working all together to find just solutions to all of these issues at the same time. So these like talking points from the 1960s and 70s, I think they're outdated.
Thank you for that. And I would personally agree. It's a tragedy that, these two histories are even put up against each other when, Palestinians aren't the only people who have experienced the Nakba. And the key here is the recognition of that narrative. So I actually want to divert back. I think we'll have time for 2 more questions. So I'm going to send this one to Matthias. We have an audience member asking, as Palestinian refugees in hosting countries such as Lebanon or Jordan continue to struggle with access to work and livelihood opportunities, what are some ways that UNRWA works to create durable ways of livelihood and support in a way that incorporates Palestinian refugee decision-making and leadership in a dignified way?
Yeah, that's another complicated or difficult question to answer in a good manner. I mean, I think it starts with basic education. I have worked all around the world. I've really never met people who are so keen on education as the Palestinians, and definitely the ones I've met in Lebanon and here in Gaza. That's, I think, as Nelson Mandela famously said, education is the most potent weapon against illiteracy and poverty and injustice. And I think Palestinians really practice that. So, I think the value of us educating generation after generation of children in our schools is the starting point. We then try to go a bit beyond that, linking it more with the question of what can we do in terms of job opportunities, etc. Of course, we don't set the job market and the laws in Lebanon, so we cannot change that. We can advocate for that. What we do is vocational training. Here in Gaza, we have the oldest vocational training school UNRWA runs that goes back to the 1950s. So it's not just about academic pathways after basic education, it's also vocational training. In a place like this blockade collapsing economy, there are many skills that are needed that are not necessarily taught at universities. So let me give you a concrete example. We last year ran for the first time a course for solar panel engineers, and it was exclusively for women. Which was absolutely fascinating because they had to overcome a lot of prejudice. One of them recently spoke to Commissioner General and said she could see that it was just so unusual to see a woman with a toolkit, the toolbox running around the campus. And she could see the young men sort of looking at her strangely. But she's found work. She's part of a fascinating entrepreneurial little outfit that is looking at establishing themselves as solar panel engineers. It's a small example. Another one is we established a project where there's about 800-900 internet graduates coming from universities in Gaza. What many people don't know is there's actually 9 universities here. Every year, 800-900 university graduates with internet and programming skills and so on come onto the market. Now, the blockade so far has not blocked the internet. So we've established a little outfit called Gaza Gateway, where these young people then use their skills to connect with other parts of the world, translate programs, computer programs into Arabic, for example, and so on. So those are some ideas, practical ideas of what we're trying to do. I want to underline that at the end of the day, this is drops in the ocean. At the end of the day, what is needed is to come back to Lebanon, to turn the laws around. You know, Palestinians should have the right to work in any job, just like the Lebanese do. So I think the much more powerful thing would be to get that changed rather than just educate. Here in Gaza, it's lift the blockade. You know, people have the skills and the education and can go and find work in Israel, in Egypt, and elsewhere. So I think, you know, legislation and opening opportunities is the really powerful thing to do.
Thank you so much for that. That was a very clear and concise answer for us on how Palestinian refugees are doing in that aspect. The final question, I am also going to somewhat divide between Dalia and Raed, just because I really feel like you can both answer it. And this will probably be the last one before we have to wrap things up. But this question is basically saying, J Street, which calls itself a pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-peace organization, has growing influence among liberal democratic members of Congress. Its current position is to allow a very limited, primarily symbolic number of refugees to return to Israel for the purpose of family reunification. Are there realistic opportunities to work with J Street, and I assume other liberal Zionist organizations, to expand this to a more meaningful number, perhaps 1 million or more? Or do the panelists consider any compromise that maintains a Jewish majority in Israel to be unethical and an illegal non-starter? And to couple this question, this one will actually be for all three of you. International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People was held just a few days ago. So this is more of a personal question to all of you. In what ways can solidarity be shown to Palestinian refugees specifically? So that first question to Raed and Dalia, and I guess we'll end with Matthias to answer that question for us as well.
Dalia, why don't you go first this time? I think you're muted.
Sorry. So essentially what I think of questions like these, so with liberal Zionist organizations or organizations like J Street that peddle that, you know, pro-Israel, pro-Palestine stance, I think at times it's very difficult to actually have some sort of tangible change, essentially just because of the differences in ideology. So, you know, if you are looking for Palestinian justice, if you're looking for ending the occupation, Palestinian right of return, all of these different factors will clash with these liberal organizations that peddle that pro-Israel, pro-Palestine stance, because they will essentially, they won't be able to work together and they won't coincide properly. So I would say that organizations such as J Street themselves haven't actually concisely done any proper effort to allow Palestinians at the forefront. And the second part of that question, actually, where it's saying compromising, where it's a morally or ethical compromise just because of a Jewish majority, I don't look at it that way, because I consider that Palestinians and, you know, the Jewish population are aware of each other's presence, and it's a fact. So it's not about the compromise, it's just about the fact that it's a clash of ideologies. It's a clash of what each party wants. So Palestinians are not going to accept concessions from organizations such as these, especially in the United States, because many of these people who work with these organizations are essentially seen as second class. You know, a lot of the times you won't hear from these people. Palestinians themselves are already silenced and criticized in the media field, in the academia field. Activists themselves are already silent. So you have to go a different route in order to actually have some sort of tangible change. And J Street's mission itself is incompatible with what Palestinian activists want, especially because there's a different clash in ideologies. Palestinians are not a monolith as well, so it's a very difficult to actually pinpoint that that change.
I'll make a couple of quick points, Nuran. The first one is when you look at the big picture, the historic pro-Israel lobby in the United States has been falling apart. The issue of the positions, for example, of AIPAC represent a minority of Jewish Americans in 2020, which is amazing when you think about it. And the issue of the situation in Israel-Palestine has been shifting a lot. It has become a more of a progressive issue. It has become more of a partisan issue. Back in around 9/11, Israel-Palestine were not a partisan issue, and now it is a partisan issue. Things are moving a lot, and in this space, especially with younger Jewish Americans, there is a different take on Palestinian rights, on rights in general. I feel like I've lived in DC for 15 years now, and I work very, very closely with Jewish American organizations, including JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, or if not now, or even J Street. I know that J Street has moved a lot in the last 5 or 6 years. Their positions have moved a lot closer to where organizations that work for a just resolution with equal rights stand. I've recently even heard that a number of organizations, including, I think, J Street, have changed their positions pertaining to conditioning US aid to Israel, which was literally what we refer to in DC as a third rail politics. Like, you don't want to touch it, and now it's becoming an issue that is more accepted. So I mean, I think like honestly, I feel like there is a movement to a better place where we can work with organizations that before it was harder to have a common ground working with them. But the second point I want to say is that as a DC insider myself, it always surprises me in a positive way to speak to people outside of the Beltway. Because, living in DC, you end up, accommodating to the political realities of DC. And DC, as a bubble that rules this country and maybe a part of the world, is way to the right of where the country is. It's more conservative, the possibilities are less. So it's always refreshing for me to hear people outside of DC being more principled and pushing for quicker change. Here in DC, I feel like it's a melting pot with activists end up attending the same meetings over and over and over. So, whether you liked or did not like representatives of other organizations, we end up working together at the end of the day. And it's not an issue of compromising our principles. I think we can be true to our principles and think about pragmatic common grounds to collaborate with even those who would disagree with their ideologies to some extent, right? There is always a line to draw there. Obviously, we're not going to work with white supremacists or other racist organizations, whether they're racist or sexist or Zionist or whatever other issues. There is a line there to draw, but I think opening space up for collaboration is always my personal choice. Extending a hand and reaching out to others to see if we have spaces where we can work together.
I hope that answered the audience member's question. It answered it to me. So the final question to you.
We're out of time, Nora.
Yeah, we're looking a bit out of time, but just final to you, you'll have the final word. What does international solidarity with Palestinian refugees look like to you?
Thank you again, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this really deep discussion. My simple answer to that is, as many as you will know, of you will know, the United Nations is guided by 17 sustainable development goals up till 2030. And I think the most, important way we can show as UN and international community solidarity is by ensuring that the slogan that underlies these 17 goals, which is "leave no one behind," applies to Palestinians. The 17 goals are not for the developing world, not for the industrialized world. They are for everyone, including the Palestinians. So I think the more we can show that in whatever we do, Palestinians are included by default, the more Palestinians themselves, I hope, will feel and see and experience solidarity. And to be a bit more specific, there are some goals among the 17 that are obvious. There's one about hunger, achieving zero hunger, goal 2, and that applies in Gaza. Many people here are hungry. We need to ensure that that gets addressed. Good health is the goal 3, quality education, goal 4. What many people often forget, including within UN circles, is goal 16 is called peace, justice, and strong institutions. I have it right in front of me here. And that's what we need to practice. It's not just the obvious stuff, education and health. It is about justice, peace, and strong institutions. And the more we can do, as I said earlier, to create space where Palestinians themselves can define, and especially, of course, here in the occupied territories, what this means for them in practical reality, in dialogue with the other side, the more I think we will be experiencing real solidarity.
Thank you so much. And with that, the hour has flown by. Thank you so much to our panelists, Matthias from Gaza, Dalia, and Raed. There will be a recording of this panel available on the MEI YouTube page and on the event link that you registered with. So thank you so much to our panelists for having this discussion with us. And hopefully we will continue to have important discussions about Palestinian refugees in the future. So keep an eye out on the MEI Palestine and Palestinian Israeli Affairs page for that. So thank you so much. Thank you to the audience. And with that, I bid you all a great day.
Thank you so much.